Good afternoon again, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Gavin Petier, and I'm the Director of the Multilateral Relations Division of the Ministry of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs. May I ask you to pay attention to the security briefing, which will be delivered to us, followed by the national anthem.
At UTT, we have a duty of care to our guests, students, and staff in maintaining a safe, smoke-free campus environment. In this regard, we have a few announcements aimed at ensuring your safety at our facility. Please be guided by the following. The campus is equipped with an electronic fire detection and alarm system. In the event of an emergency which requires an evacuation, you will be guided to the appropriate muster point. The main muster point on campus is located at the western end of the fire ground, which is north of the main building. Your evacuation routes are as follows. Exit the auditorium using the doors either to the left or right of the room. Once outside the auditorium, follow the directional signs to exit the building. Proceed north to the muster point, located on the fire training ground, and await further instructions. You will be required to remain at the muster point until the all clear is given by UTT or fire officials. Please note, elevators should not be used in the event of an evacuation. There is no scheduled testing of the campus fire alarm system today, so in the event that the alarm system is activated, you are required to do the following. Evacuate in a safe but brisk manner. Proceed to the muster point located at the western end of the fire training ground. Await further instructions. Washrooms are located just outside of the auditorium on your right. A health and wellness room is available on the campus should the need for first aid attention arise. Please note there is a no smoking policy on the campus. No food and beverage are allowed in the auditorium. We do hope you have a pleasant and safe stay at our campus. Thank you.
Please have your seats. Your Excellency, Dennis Francis, President of the 70th Session of the United Nations General Assembly, Dr. Kieran Niles, Acting Director of the Institute of International Relations and the moderator of this afternoon's event, heads of diplomatic missions, other members of the Diplomatic Corps, representatives of international organizations, members of His Excellency's delegation, representatives of government agencies, representatives of civil society, students and alumni of the University of the West Indies, members of the media, virtual participants, ladies and gentlemen all. Good afternoon. I am tasked to deliver greetings on behalf of Senator the Honorable Dr. Amory Brown, Minister of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs, and to thank you for your participation this afternoon, both in person and online, at this historic roundtable event. This official visit to Trinidad and Tobago of His Excellency Dennis Francis, President of the 70th session of the General Assembly of the United Nations, assumes monumental significance for the government and people of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. Patriotic sentiment and the imperative of expressing appreciation for the unparalleled augmentation of this country's international standing arising from President Francis's ascension to and performance in this revered position necessitated an invitation to him to pay an official visit to Trinidad and Tobago. President Francis's tenure has been marked with inspired and inspiring leadership and impartial and cogent adjudication over the affairs that engage the 193 member states of the United Nations General Assembly. His presidency has coincided with significant crises in the international environment, but he has been able to weather the storms and preside judiciously and effectively when consideration of these existential dangers engages the General Assembly. As this country's candidate for the presidency of the 78th regular session of the General Assembly, His Excellency was elected by acclamation on June 1st, 2023, to preside over the General Assembly from September 2023 to September 2024. The General Assembly is the main deliberative policy-making and representative organ of the United Nations and discusses questions or issues that fall within the scope of the United Nations Charter or which relate to the powers and functions of any organ provided for in its charter. The Assembly may also submit recommendations to the United Nations member states, the Security Council, or both on any such questions or issues, except regarding disputes or situations that the Security Council may be currently addressing. As I alluded to, His Excellency's presidency has coincided with the resurgence of numerous violent conflicts, aggression, and external strife, all in the existing context of the planetary crises of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. This confluence of factors, exacerbated by a weakened multilateral system, has adversely impacted international peace, security, and development. However, President Francis has managed to shepherd the work of the General Assembly in rebuilding trust, tackling the cascading crises, and gathering momentum towards getting the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals back on track. He has done so, assisted by his intimate knowledge of the unique perspective of small island developing states. Ambassador Dennis Francis has had a career spanning approximately 40 years in the diplomatic service of Trinidad and Tobago. For 18 of those years unbroken, he held the rank of ambassador until his compulsory retirement from the career service in 2016 accorded him the distinction of being the longest-serving ambassador of Trinidad and Tobago. Before demitting office as the Director of Multilateral Relations, His Excellency functioned as Senior Advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs on all multilateral matters, including climate change and the negotiations for the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Today's roundtable commemorates a flagship initiative engineered by President Francis during his all-consuming tenure, that is Sustainability Week. The theme of today's session, #Choose Sustainability, a path to resilient and prosperous societies, will address the vital role of the United Nations General Assembly with respect to the small island developing states existing in a hostile and unfavorable international environment. This is to be considered a unique opportunity to engage with Ambassador Francis and gain valuable insights into global sustainability initiatives instituted under his presidency. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased now to invite President Francis and Dr. Niles to be seated on the stage so that discussions can begin. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Wow. Okay, that's better. Good afternoon, everyone. All right. So when I was first asked to do this, they said to me, "You want something a little like hard talk, you know? Have you ever seen hard talk?" I was just like, we're not going to do hard talk, but it's going to be engaging. Because I know a lot of people have a lot of questions. They're very eager to engage with one of our longest, probably the longest, as he just said, the longest serving ambassador from Trinidad and Tobago, who's now ascended to this position. There's a lot of anticipation. We opened questions online, Ambassador, before today, and the questions flooded in. And so I have many of those questions here. So for those of you at home wondering if your question is going to be asked, it might be. I can't guarantee. But today we are going to be taking some of the questions live online and also live here. We will be spanning topics from diplomacy as a career, different global events, war and peace, AI and technology, sustainability, and climate change. And if there are other things that persons want to ask about, we can take them after, but I'm going to take the questions and take the topics in sections as we go on. But we're going to begin by me just giving you the floor, Ambassador, to speak about Sustainability Week, which you actually mentioned last night, of which I'm very, very proud. I have to admit my bias from upfront. I do teach climate policy at the University of West Indies, and so this is an area that's also very dear to my heart. So I'll hand over the floor to you to share with us a little bit about what you've done at the UN as it relates to Sustainability Week. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Dr. Niles. In the interest of time, I will forego the formality of the protocolary salutations. Let me begin by expressing my sincere appreciation to you, Dr. Niles, and to the Ministry of Foreign and CARICOM Affairs for the generous invitation to join you today. It is a warm homecoming indeed to return to this vibrant campus at St. Augustine. Well, of course, we are in Port of Spain, a place that nurtured my own curiosity as a student and provided a strong academic underpinning for a most fulfilling career in diplomacy and public service. And while I'm turning my page, it's a delight to see someone here who was at the Institute as a librarian when I was a student there. From conversations with impassioned professors who animated the classrooms to late night study sessions with fellow students, I had the opportunity and indeed the good fortune of diagnosing and exploring questions related, among other things, to the Caribbean diplomatic and developmental experiences from 360 degrees of perspective. And no stone was left unturned. As today's talented young leaders, you are now assuming this critical mantle of inquiry. It will fall to you to make the hard policy choices that will sustain or suppress inclusive economic growth, preserve the diverse expressions of our cultural heritage, uphold the core tenets of international law, advance human rights for all, and in doing so, write the next chapters of a larger, uniquely Caribbean story of sustainability and resilience. It is an awesome responsibility, one that will be taken amid a host of global challenges, from conflict and climate change to poverty, hunger, and food insecurity, challenges that are stymieing progress across the 2030 agenda for sustainable development. our shared blueprint for global peace and security and prosperity. One that frankly cannot be fulfilled without addressing the debt crisis, fueling dangerously unsustainable socioeconomic disparities between the global north and the global south, and indeed within countries in the south, particularly small island developing states and other developing countries in vulnerable situations. More than 40% of SIDS have a debt to GDP ratio above 40%, with some exceeding 100%. This means filling these gaps and moreover fixing an outdated global financial system that has in fact disadvantaged many by failing to assist them in building resilience against exogenous shocks. This has created identifiable cycles of boom and bust, in which scarce resources have to be deployed, often to rebuild the same infrastructure damaged or destroyed repeatedly by cataclysmic events engendered either by climate or geology. Choosing sustainability therefore means promoting sustainable consumption and sustainable production in every facet of human existence, so as to leave behind an intergenerational inheritance to allow future generations to enjoy the environmental assets that have supported our civilization. Choosing sustainability means strategically embracing a diversity of perspectives and backgrounds and empowering people to unleash progress across the 2030 agenda, ensuring that the benefits of peace and prosperity are shared equitably by all, with no one left out or left behind. As a contribution to these efforts, I convened the first ever Sustainability Week in the General Assembly in April of this year, a series of events focused on critical sectors of the economy, including tourism, transport, infrastructure, and energy, and the urgent question of debt sustainability, largely informed by the realities attending small island developing states as middle-income countries, as well as low-lying coastal states and communities. Taken together, the week's events offered a broad platform to drive progress across the Sustainable Development Goals, with a view to ensuring their delivery in 2030, and to move the dial on issues that are central to countries in special situations, such as the LDCs, the least developed countries, and the LLDCs, the landlocked developing countries. Building on this success, at my initiative, the General Assembly will convene on the 25th of September a high-level meeting at the level of heads of state and government to address the existential threat posed by sea level rise. This is a matter of such complexity and implications that it demands urgent attention by the international community as critical issues of sustainability arise in the context of the future of these countries. So foreboding is this issue, particularly in the Pacific, that some countries in that region have already entered into legal agreements with Australia to relocate their populations in the event of maritime inundation. But quite apart from the loss of physical territory, there are other sensitive issues that will need to be addressed. For example, among these would be the issue of loss of culture and heritage, built up over large swaths of time. Cultures lost are not easily replaced, if at all, which begs the question of loss of national identity. All consequences of the human-induced problem of climate change, to which the impacted countries made the most minuscule of contribution. The aim is to stimulate and encourage multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder collaboration to deliver on our promises and to ease the anxieties of millions of people living in small island developing states and low-lying coastal areas, some of whom are facing the real threat of submergence of their island home beneath the sea. In that regard, I can cite the example of the island of Tonga, which is daily losing territory at an alarming rate. Throughout, small island developing states have been in the vanguard in advancing these conversations, actively engaging in the General Assembly deliberations and harnessing the full strength of the multilateral system for the benefit of all. Their leadership was on full display when 9 islands nations, led by Vanuatu, successfully brought a case, successfully brought a case to the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, which ruled that carbon emissions can be considered a sea pollutant. The tribunal's rulings obliges countries to mitigate the effects of emissions on oceans, potentially creating an important basis for future climate jurisprudence. Their efforts also laid a strong foundation for a transformational 4th International Conference on Small Island Developing States, which was successfully hosted by Antigua and Barbuda in May. As we turn our focus to the Summit of the Future in September, and beyond to the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development in 2025, we will need your insights on how to make sustainability the default choice, how to popularize the practice of sustainability in our daily lives in order to restore and preserve the natural balance of nature on the planet as a means of stabilizing our systems, including our climate systems. So I challenge you, all of you, to choose sustainability in the small and large things that you do. For example, turn the tap off when brushing your teeth. Act to save and not to waste water. Because the reality is, our reserves of water are running globally, are running worryingly low. And by walking or taking a bicycle ride to work or take the bus, because that will save the addition of carbon into the atmosphere. All of those options help to reduce our carbon footprint and goes to the solution of climate change. I'm confident that working strategically together, big and small, strong and weak, technologically proficient and technologically deficient, we have it within us to fortify the foundations of trust and cooperation that will bring us to a safer, more inclusive, more prosperous, more sustainable world for all. I look forward to the discussion that will follow on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you again, Ambassador. You want to hear me? All right. Thank you again for agreeing to have this conversation with us. There you go. We're going to pick it up actually where you left off. We're going to dive straight into the questions that we received. The first one, actually, you answered half of their question already, which is excellent. But they were wondering, with the growing impact of climate change on SIDS, what specific strategies can the UN General Assembly put in place to improve resilience and sustainability for such nations, especially regarding migration and displacement, which we've already begun to address. But also, they wanted to know, how can local and regional governments better align their actions within international frameworks to support those goals?
Well, that's an interesting question, because the two are indeed not separate.
Sure.
They're part of a single continuum. The Paris Climate Agreement, for example, establishes the principle that those who are mainly responsible for the problem of climate change, the big polluters in the world, the United States, China, India, Brazil, some of the others, Europe, they should bear the burden of taking action to reverse climate change proportionate to the extent to which they cause the problem. And the same principle applies to small island developing states like Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean. Now that's the big picture. But what the solution to climate change, and this is one of the unique differences in the international system today. Most of the global issues that require resolution are in fact global. They cannot be solved by any individual country acting alone, regardless of how rich or powerful you are. The fact that the United States is the wealthiest country in the world and has the most advanced technology does not empower it to solve the question of climate change on its own. Nor does China, nor does India. The action required is coordinated action and cooperation on the part of all members of the international system, based on the principle of special but differential treatment. So the large ones who have developed their economies, who are now living very successfully a life of wealth and privilege, should not be asked to pay less or to pay the same thing that, for example, a country like Suriname that has no carbon footprint. Suriname has no carbon footprint. So you would not expect the United States and Suriname to be paying at the same level. But the principle is, since it's a global problem, we share the burden globally of devising policy and taking action to reverse it. And so it's really a question of cooperation. Now, how that is interpreted at the national level and the actions taken by government to mitigate and to roll back the impacts of climate change, those are sovereign decisions that government will take. Of course, the objective is to take decisive action by 2040. And to take that action in a way that preserves, you notice I'm wearing a pin. I think it's on this. Yeah, it's 1.5 degrees pin. That is the temperature above which the climate scientists tell us global warming that exceeds this temperature, which is the temperature of the atmosphere in pre-industrial levels. Once it exceeds that, we're in for really big trouble. It will well nigh become irreversible, and small island developing states in particular, may well disappear beneath the ocean. Not to alarm you, several years ago, I was working late one night and my eyes fell on a document produced by an international organization that serves this region. And I started reading it. And a study was done that indicated then, this is back in 2012, that at current rates, if nothing is done to address the issue of climate change, the entire port of Point Lisas could disappear beneath the ocean by 2040. Consider for a moment what that would mean for the economy of Trinidad and Tobago, and what that would mean for your standard of living. All these fancy cars that are driven, they will become unaffordable. So this is real. We are in the midst of a crisis that we did not cause, but that could virtually change the course of our development and impoverish us. So this is very real. And that is why we have to keep the pressure, the diplomatic pressure on those who cause the problem, to act. Now, they're not acting in a hurry, and in fact, some of the actions that they're taking are worrisome. Coal plants have started to reappear in parts of Europe. Coal, the worst polluting substance there is on Earth. Okay? The Europeans have given a commitment to achieve some level, some threshold in terms of the public usage of electric cars. But they've abandoned, the French have abandoned, and the Germans have abandoned that plan, simply because they've discovered that the Chinese are way ahead of them in the production and supply of green cars. I was in China. It's cheaper. The Chinese government make it cheaper for their people to buy electric cars than cars with internal combustion engines. So we are witnessing a situation where, as the Secretary General likes to say, it's no longer global warming, it's global boiling. We are seeing the effects of this all over the world. The wildfires across southern Europe and in parts of California, the intense flooding across the world. Just last week, there was flooding in India, and I think a couple of other places, people died. The fact that you have in the Caribbean hurricanes, that lady who blew through, I can never remember her name, Beryl. She blew through the Caribbean. Well, Beryl is 3 months early because we've never had a situation where a cyclone is converted from a category 1 to a category 4, almost on the verge of 5, within 24 hours. That is unheard of, but it happened with Beryl. And it's proof positive that what the scientists have been saying to us is absolutely true. Those cyclones will become more virulent, and more frequent. And therefore, we have to take action. If we don't want to be victims, we have to take action to do something about this. Because it could well mean, losing our ability to survive on this planet. That is why sustainability is important. That is why we need to be more careful, more deliberate in the choices we make regarding how we use resources. Because, when you're growing up, you tend to think that there's no limit to the supply of water. That is not true. Water is limited and becoming more limited. And if we're not cautious, water can become the next basis for war in some parts of the world. Because if you consider the Nile, for example, the Nile traverses 8 or 9 countries. So who controls the water can control the development. And so sustainability in that setting is crucial. It means cooperating and managing in a way that gives equitable access, so that even if the volume of water available is shrinking, everyone gets a little bit. The problem will arise when that sort of distribution does not exist. And since you can't really do anything for water, thank God there's some here because my throat is very dry. Can't do anything without water. It demonstrates to you the extent to which we really need to take very careful action on water. But we also need to take action on fish and on plastics. You see these things? They end up at the bottom of the ocean. Plastic has been found at the depths of the ocean, 35 and 40,000 feet beneath the surface. They've been found in the gut of fish, all manner of fish. And the science tells us that if we do nothing, by 2050, there will be more plastic in the ocean than fish. Try eating bacon plastic. It's what we're looking at. Our food supply, if we're not careful, is dwindling. And it's dwindling because of a number of reasons, not the least of which engendered by human beings. Land degradation, land and soil degradation is an element of this. So choosing sustainability really requires that we rethink our actions and don't think for a minute that I'm only one person, I cannot make a difference. Because those individual discrete actions, when you amalgamate them, can have a broad impact.
Indeed.
If you act strategically as a community. And so we must do that in Trinidad and Tobago. We must show our maturity, because let's not forget, we are a polluting country. The backbone of our economy is oil and gas. And we cannot live without it. If we were to stop producing it, we would lose our standard of living and welfare. We would probably have to go back to using coal pots. Although I tell you, I've eaten coal pot food. There's nothing to beat a good roast breadfruit from a coal pot. Okay? But certainly, those things are folksy, you like to do them because it takes you back to the old days. We live in 2021. We want a life of convenience and modernization. We do not want our women to spend the entire day roasting a breadfruit on a coal pot. There are other things that we need them to do. And so sustainability requires that we take a long, hard look at lifestyles, at little things that we can do. Take the bus to the office, if you can, once a week. It makes a contribution to saving carbon. We cannot get rid of carbon at this moment, but we can do other things. And I'm pleased to learn, I was told just yesterday, that a plan is afoot to plant something like 100,000 trees in this country. That is an important thing because it counterbalances the carbon that we put into the atmosphere by virtue of the fact that we are a hydrocarbon economy. In Saudi Arabia, sustainability is so important that they have a plan in Saudi Arabia to plant, I think it's 500 million trees. Can you imagine that? In the desert. In the desert. They will transform the desert into modern cities. So, sustainability has to be a choice. We have to live smarter than we have lived for the last 150 years.
Yeah.
As if there is no limit to the use of resources. There are limits. Those of us who are geographers, I see my dear friend Gail there. We were both at Mona studying geography. And we have known since those days that ecosystems have limits. There's something called equilibrium that they always seek to establish. Once that equilibrium is disrupted, very difficult to regain it. And so we have to be conscious of what we are doing to our own environment that will affect our longevity on this planet. And not only our longevity, but the quality of life of future generations.
So, Ambassador, I have a question based on, you actually touched on two things that prisons what you wanted to know about. You just spoke about the limits. Scientists now telling us in an article in Science in 2023, we're saying that out of the 9 planetary boundaries that we have mapped so far, we've crossed 6 of those boundaries, of the 9 boundaries. What do you think? So you spoke a lot about the UN's role in terms of kind of charting a path to sustainability. And if you have questions on sustainability or climate change, please feel free to raise your hand and the mic will come to you. But just really quickly, you spoke a lot about the role of the UN in charting a new path to sustainability. However, as you mentioned, a lot of these problems are global problems and they require cooperation. Does the current trend towards trying to isolate certain countries, probably justifiably because of their behavior sometimes, does that fly in the face of the cooperation that we need to actually become a more sustainable planet?
No, it doesn't. The thing about it is, right? The UN has no power to act on its own. The UN facilitates the research. It might commission a study and it will publish the results and might sit around the table with countries to negotiate a policy or an outcome. But the UN cannot act on its own. Remember that the UN is a group of 193 independent sovereign states. So it's states that have to make the decision. And no state can make that decision for another state. Each state has the right and power to decide for itself. So we've managed to get the Paris Agreement in 2015. Everyone was happy, everyone celebrated. There was a commitment to create something called the Green Climate Fund, $100 billion by 2020. Well, it's only recently that the money in the fund started getting close to the target of $100 billion. Those who committed to it did not provide the money. And in fact, much of the rub in climate negotiations resides in the fact that climate financing has fallen way below what it needs to be. To the extent that there has been financing, albeit insufficient, woefully insufficient, only 2% of that financing goes towards adaptation. Most of it goes to mitigation, which is basically repairing and seeking to recover from some cataclysmic accident, some extreme accident. Helping countries to build with resilience so that they can withstand the force of those hurricane winds. That money has not materialized. For years and years and years, we negotiated and said, we need a loss and damage fund because many developing countries have suffered. You're having to rebuild the same infrastructure. Every 5 years, a hurricane comes, it destroys this particular bridge or road. That, I gather, has been our experience in the Manzanilla-Mayaro area. The same road, over and over, it goes. Has to be rebuilt. Bridges have to be rebuilt. Well, who should pay for that? Taxpayers of Trinidad and Tobago? Did we cause climate change? Government has to find money in the domestic budget, and government has no choice but to do it. Because then villages get cut off, kids can't go to school. Taxis will not take people to their home. The price automatically goes up because they have to take the long route. People's standards of living change because of this problem, which we did not cause. So there isn't, each country, one hopes, will do everything in its power to conform with the undertakings in the climate agreement. But let's not forget that we live in a world that is highly political. And those who are not really committed or who use the opportunity of the cameras to give the impression that they are on the right side of history because the NGOs are paying attention and will take them to task if they are found lacking, will try to opt out. So, for example, it took about 7 years for there to be an agreement to establish the Loss and Damage Fund. And that only happened in Abu Dhabi a year and a half ago. Thankfully, there have been some commitments made, people from Abu Dhabi, the Germans, the Americans, and some others. But that really needs to be a huge fund because it is from that fund that there will be a need for drawdowns to deal with the effects, to build resilience. So, for example, you're building this facility, you build it in such a way that it can withstand a Category 5 hurricane. You build it in such a way that it might be able to withstand a Category 7 or 8 earthquake. You build it in such a way that in a public emergency, it can multitask as a public shelter. Because during these events, one of the problems that exists for developing countries is that there aren't many options, safe options, that the population can go to be safe. And so the facilities you build need to be multi-purpose to save money and to save lives, but strong enough to withstand these external forces. So sustainability helps to do that. Sustainability helps building sustainably, using solar panels, for example, converting to green energy if you can. And I believe we do have policy in this country regarding the use of solar panels. Did you know, how many of you were aware that the entire airport in Antigua is powered by solar power? The entire airport. There are options and there are ways. Given that we are a small island that's very fragile, we have a very fragile economy, ecosystem here. We need to take these precautions to ensure we're already losing a lot of land around the country. On the coasts. Coasts are disappearing. Sea is encroaching. And those are the signs that sea level rise is upon us.
Ambassador, so I think there's a lot of agreement, Ambassador, around the need to become more sustainable. I think, and there's a question here about this as well. You mentioned before the politics, and you also mentioned the fact that you're seeing coal plants go up in Europe. But one of the reasons that the European countries are saying that they're building coal plants is because they don't want to buy Russian oil and gas. So is this, and I don't know if it's a false choice, I'd love to get your thoughts on whether or not you think this is a false choice or not. But when we refer to the poly crisis, we're thinking about war and instability happening around the same time as climate change. And so countries are saying that, well, they don't want to buy Russian oil and gas, so therefore, in the short term, they need to go back to coal. What are your thoughts on that? And what is the role of the UN, in your opinion, in terms of helping countries to navigate that poly crisis?
Well, I tell you, I happen to have been hosted in Switzerland from 2006 to 2012. And I remember very well, there was a lot of chatter in Europe among the governments about the overdependence of Europe on Russian oil. There's a pipeline from Russia that delivers gas to parts of Europe. And the Europeans have always been concerned that if you upset the Russians and they turn off the spigot, that's the end of the European economy. But I also remember that after Europe actually had very many nuclear power plants, after the tsunami that hit Asia and spread across the world, I think this would have been in 2008, Angela Merkel was chancellor in Germany. She took a decision immediately. Remember that the nuclear power plant in Japan had been affected by the tsunami. And in fact, there was a lot of anxiety and worry that the fish in the Pacific had all become contaminated with nuclear material. Some fish were tested as far away as in California, I remember, and there was concern about contamination of that fish. And so after Japan happened, that the flooding of the nuclear power plants, Germany closed down all its nuclear power plants and said, this is not safe. So then they became totally dependent on Russian oil and gas. I was in great shock when I went back to New York to discover that 10 years later, Europe was still so heavily dependent on Russian oil and gas. And they knew that it constituted a major risk. But perhaps for reasons of economics, I'm not an energy expert, nor am I an economist. Perhaps for reasons of economics, that shift never took place. Now, we are reneging on the commitment they gave by reverting to coal, to the usage of coal. Now, that is not consistent with and in violation of commitments given under the Paris Agreement, because they are the ones who must lead the charge in taking action to slow down and correct the impacts of climate change. So that argument does not go through the wash for me at all. You gave an undertaking and there was no force majeure. Nobody held a gun to your neck and said, you have to agree to get out of coal and to use only green energy. They entered into those undertakings of their own free will, and they are obliged to honor it. Because if it were the reverse, that is exactly the line they would tell us. That is exactly the line they would tell us. International commitments must be honored. So, however they want to solve their problem, that's a matter for them. But it must not and cannot mean reneging on the Paris Agreement. Because then if they do that, others will start to follow. And before you know it, the whole thing unravels. Who suffers? Us.
If I were in the audience, I would clap at that point. If I were in the audience, I would clap at that stage. There's a question over there. I see your hand up. Ms. Tambu, I see your hand.
Thank you very much. All protocols observed. Honored President Francis and Dr. Nance. It is a sobering time now in the world. It's a global problem with 193 sovereign states at risk because of climate change and all the effects. But we who are elders here are sitting formulating rules and regulation. How about we think about transforming the school environment where the younger generation can react to what's happening or what will happen to their lives? Are we saving their lives? And in your capacity, sir, UNESCO, can they put on a drive throughout the world where they can function and bring more educational, scientific, and cultural changes in the lives of the younger generation so they could meet us coming up the ladder? I would like to see you at the helm of 193 sovereign states bring reality to how we can teach our younger generation. Thank you.
Thank you. Right in front of you, Mr. Ambassador. There's one question in the right in front of you. Take them together.
Your Excellency, you touched on it, but as a Caribbean man with a global platform, how would you speak to our Caribbean governments, specifically Trinidad, Suriname, Guyana, CARICOM states as well, in terms of how we balance the discussion around the sustainability piece and having the greater powers that be indicate that they, especially the new ones like Guyana and Suriname, dial back from exploring the oil and gas element, which is so crucial to ours and the economy. We've grown up in the Caribbean with a lot of hardship. We've seen what oil and gas can do for our economies. Suriname and Guyana are wanting that for their people. How would you advise the governments now, based on what the global mandates are in terms of driving sustainability, to say, pull back on developing the oil and gas? And these two countries are carbon sinks, as you indicated. So balancing the political and the economical on the global scale, how would you advise our governments, or what are your thoughts on that? Because, you know, I have my own personal views on it, because they've already exploited their own in Europe and UK and so on in the North Sea. And, you know, our small guys here are now just getting a little bit of it. How do we dial back on that when our economic survival relies on it? And how do we balance that conversation?
All right, I'm just going to take one more, taking groups of threes. I saw this hand first, so there's one more, and then we come back for another round, but there's a hand, right here, there's one right here, I'm not seeing that. I think that hand was up first, but we can still take it, sir.
Hello, Ambassador. I have a question for you regarding the 1.5 degree issue. So I follow climate change negotiations very importantly. I have a question regarding you and your discussion with the Secretary General and the UNFCCC Secretary General. With the emissions firmly seen, and in some cases increasing globally, the 1.5 degree target is looking more likely to be met and even surpassed before that 2040 timeline that you give. Has there been any discussions to commission a report to assess and even refresh that timeline so that governments globally can have informed discussion on the seriousness of this matter, as you said, especially SIDS and LDCs? Thank you.
Ambassador, over to you. There's 3 questions.
I'll take the second one over here first. How would I advise governments like the Guyanese government and the government of Trinidad and Tobago? The Sustainable Development Goals, which of course the UN committed to delivering by 2030, includes a goal that says that people have a right to access to affordable, clean energy. It is a right. Because, and it's an important right, because in very many parts of the world, such access does not exist. In parts of Africa, I don't recall what the numbers are, but there are hundreds of millions of people in Africa. I think it's something like 2.4 billion people worldwide who do not have access to affordable energy. What that means is, basically, they're polluting. They're using firewood, as in Haiti and in many other places, for cooking, whatever. So they're adding carbon to the atmosphere. And so it's in the general interest of everyone, of the Commonwealth of countries, to get these people onto the grid where they have access to clean and affordable energy. The affordable is important, because if it is not affordable, they will burn firewood, which is free in some places. So that's a goal. Easier said than accomplished. In the case of Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana, yes, we are. Energy is the backbone of the economy. And I don't think we have any reason to be an apologist for the fact that God has graced us with having supplies of energy. I don't hear the people in Texas bemoaning the fact that Texas is an energy state, or the North Sea in England, or the Saudis. They're not bemoaning it. But we must not appear to be arrogant and insensitive to the fact that the global movement is to shift away from this polluting substance that could shorten our life on this planet, that has effects. The economists have a beautiful word for this, externalities that undermine and create costs, other costs in parts of our lives. We must not appear to be insensitive. Quite the opposite. We must join the movement as we have to say that this is morally and ethically wrong. You polluted the atmosphere. I didn't do it. You're complicating the life of my people. Sea level is rising. The volume of fish in the sea is shrinking because you developed your economy without constraints. And now, when I am seeking to provide a reasonable standard of healthcare and education for my people, you're asking me to turn my back on the very product that can provide the resources necessary to do that. Are you prepared to replace those resources? If you ask that question, I'm very sure the answer you will get is no. Because the other thing that the Sustainable Development Goal says, it's very clever, that the responsibility for the reforms to develop the country resides with the government. The UN has beautiful language to say things that perhaps some people would prefer not to have said. For example, they will say, governments must take ownership of the processes to achieve sustainable development. What they're saying is you must pay. Because the era of foreign aid is gone. No one is giving you anything for free. Developing countries 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when I joined the Foreign Service, were able to access concessional aid based on their per capita income. For all practical purposes, that is gone. Development finance and development aid is shrinking. It's not increasing. At the very time when the gap between the global north and the global south is expanding. In other words, the poor in the south is getting poorer. Consider this. One man who curiously, not curiously, is in trouble now, right now, can buy a company for $41 billion. One man. While there are 900 million hungry people who do not know where breakfast is coming from tomorrow morning, living on this planet. But there's a further 900 million people who are something referred to in the literature as food insecure. And when there's another 900 million people who live in abject poverty, hopelessness, they have no chance, none, of getting out of poverty. But people are buying tickets, wouldn't you know? People in this world are already buying tickets to take a vacation to the moon. This is the world we're living in. Huh? So, because globalization has not been fair, people have been left out and left behind. That really is the way the market works. And I'm not disparaging the market, because we need the market. nor am I disparaging wealth, because we need wealth. We need growth. Growth produces wealth. Growth provides jobs and sustenance for people. They give people jobs, give people dignity, a sense of purpose, pride, comfort, and reassurance that you're making a contribution to your society and to your country. All of these things come with growth. So we must work hard to get growth, to create growth. But the system is not fair. I say to people all the time, poverty is not a choice. If it were a choice, it would not exist. No one chooses poverty. No mother chooses not to be able to feed their children. At all. And so we must allow the Europeans to sort out where they get their energy from, but it must not impact their obligations, the moral and practical obligations, and their commitments to the rest of the world and to us. Ma'am, you asked about the role of UNESCO in developing programs that assist and support young children to understand the importance of all of these things we're talking about. Well, you're actually talking to a former chairman of the National Commission for UNESCO of Trinidad and Tobago. And we've tried to do just that. We've tried to do just that. UNESCO is, most people believe, and they're not wrong, but UNESCO is an organization dealing with education, science, and culture. But UNESCO was actually established as an organization to promote, facilitate, and encourage intercultural and interreligious dialogue as a way of building peace. UNESCO is a peace organization. And God knows we need peace. We need it now more than we ever did, because peace is under duress. The natural instinct that man seems to have in the face of conflict to revert to violence is extremely worrying. And we're seeing this happening with greater rapidity every day. Sometimes through a violation of the charter, as in the case of Ukraine, or sometimes through civil strife, where in one country people take up arms that cause dislocation of massive numbers of people. So that's two of the questions. There was a third one.
On the reports. Well, he didn't say IPCC, but he was talking about the reports that the UN does.
So the research commission report done to that country, we want on the timeline of 1.5 degrees. And in some cases, increase.
Yes.
Should there be one? There hasn't been any discussion we had to your reports are showing that timeline, but
Well, I know that from time to time, the IPCC releases data and releases reports. I would want to have my staff check that question, because I am not myself a climate expert, and I do not want to give you an inaccurate answer. So if we can have someone check that and get back to you, I'd be very grateful. But the thing is that the science is clear. The science is not going to change. We have to change. But you see, and this is something very nefarious that has happened since 2016. Okay? Because a very strong anti-climate lobby has been created in some of the most influential countries in the world, and a very strong anti-science lobby has been created in some of the most scientifically powerful countries in the world. So guess what? I understand for the first time in human history, the extent to which people are vaccinating their kids before sending them to school to protect them has plummeted. Some people are willing to take the risk to send their children to school unvaccinated. With all that's going on, malaria is back. Polio is back in some places. People still willing to take those risks because of what happened with COVID-19. The strong lobby, the strong anti-science lobby, don't trust it. Drink this horse medicine and you'll be fine. Because of what was done, you would have seen what was done to people who have devoted their entire lives to medicine and research, the manner in which they were savaged professionally. And so now, and this is something we don't understand, when we create these situations, they don't go away after the event has passed. They linger and they affect everything else. So now we're facing a situation where young children are going to school, in some places, unvaccinated, creating a risk to themselves and others.
I see two hands up. I see Dr. Sajuan, and I think that's Fasha behind it. So, Dr. Sajuan?
Good afternoon, Ambassador. There's so much food for thought in all that you are speaking to. With respect to Europe and its decision to go against what they committed to with respect to the Paris Agreement and revert the coal, what is the penalty? You've been very strong in terms of saying, they should not renege. What is the penalty? So I have three questions. So that's the first thing, because if there's no penalty, then pretty much what I want. And isn't that really the major issue with respect to the whole issue of climate change and commitments being made by countries? There is no real penalty for changing. The second has to do with the issue of sustainability-driven development. I am so on board with you in terms of what we need to do, particularly in the region of small island developing states SIDS. But repeatedly, we don't. Let's take the barrel that just passed through the Caribbean. Only last year, I did work in St. Vincent, visited Canoan, and there's so much new buildings being put up, private homes, very, very large homes. And then barrel struck, and we see the result, which means that the infrastructure that is being built without any kind of resistance to these things, which comes back and links back to the whole issue of government and what is government doing in order to ensure that new infrastructure being put up is resistant to climate change, etc. You talked about the issue of Antigua and its airport. Belize, 85% of its energy is from alternative energy at this point in time. So there are places that are doing stuff. In St. Vincent is constructing a port that is going to be solar powered. A lot of the homes there are solar powered. And when it comes to Trinidad and Tobago, you talked about Trinidad, but let me just set the record straight. There's only a solar water heater that there's an incentive on the books for us to do anything with. We're talking about increasing the price of electricity. We're supposed to be minimum in the region. We're talking about hopefully Piarco Airport might be electrified soon by solar. And there's some plan to build the largest plant, but we are really not in a serious way talking the conversation as to how do we convert our domestic use and how does government use its fiscal tool in order to make that happen. And then finally, the issue of Guyana and Suriname. You said Suriname's currently zero carbon footprint, but that's going to change because Suriname is about to launch in terms of some significant
drilling of oil, much as Guyana is doing. And I agree, these countries have a right to be able to offer their countries a means of development. The reality is the reality. The world is very rapidly overheating, and the volume of oil and gas coming out of these countries can seriously impacting. So a solution, why doesn't those who really cause the problem in the first place put a value to what Guyana is currently bringing to market, could potentially bring to the market, and pay them, leave it on the ground, so that Guyana, Suriname, etc., does have the resources to be able to develop its country, but the oil and gas remains down there. Because another reality is that major markets of the world are in fact putting in carbon taxes on imports, where if what you produce to send into those markets use fossil fuel, there's a high penalty to it. So going forward, there are lots of things to consider, but my thing is, pay countries like Guyana and Suriname so that it's left there and allow them to have the resources to move aggressively into alternative and yet develop their countries, just like us.
We have one more before it's I mean, we also have a question online as well, but Asha, your hand is up.
Good afternoon, Your Excellency. It's an honor to be part of this discussion here with you today. So I along with Dr. Sri, and I just have 3 questions. Hopefully they're not too.
That's going to be 6 questions in this one section, but go ahead.
Okay, so in the context of the polluter pays principle, you mentioned that the countries that have contributed the most to climate change, they have not committed to the GCF. Are there any sort of, because the Paris Agreement is a legally binding document, but is there any sort of legal agreements that these countries will be compelled, or should we wait for litigation actions from the vulnerable nations that have been experiencing the effects of climate change? Second question would be, it's an election year in the US. If it goes one way, the Paris Agreement may be hampered when it comes to their commitment. And as you know, the US is one of the largest polluters. How would that affect the Paris Agreement, and what do you expect from COP29 if that's the case? And lastly, you spoke about the actions required from all of us as a citizenry, and in the context of the Caribbean as well. How do you think we can propel, the achievements of the SDGs without, having that adequate amount of resources to do so? Thank you.
There are more questions online, and online I hear you have the last thing on climate change, then we move to another topic. Ambassador, I have to hand it over to you with those 6 questions.
Let's take the Suriname-Guyana issue. Listen, we live in a highly political world. Okay? Countries sometimes do unpopular things, or things that they know would attract criticism and sanction from others. And when they do those things, there's a technique that they use to mollify the effect of it. They make grand statements of policy that seek to explain, but not really explain, that seek to overshadow the negative thing that they really want to do. So there's a way for the Caribbean energy producers to manage their interaction with third parties and with the international system. And it involves, number one, accepting responsibility for making a contribution, because everyone needs to contribute to the solution. This is an extremely important objective that there is international cooperation to solve the problem so that everyone fits under the umbrella. That's the first thing. You're not stopping drilling oil or gas. You're not slowing it down. Those are decisions that will be made by the market. You're continuing to do that. But while you're doing that, you're making statements in fora across the world about the need for sustainability, about the fact that the future of your young people is being imperiled by transnational corporations who have one objective, one single objective: take as much as they can, make as many millions of dollars of profit, and move on. And therefore, as a responsible government, your first duty after securing your country and people is to look after the welfare of your people. So you balance, and you come home and you adopt policy. You decide, as Trinidad and Tobago have, that we will reduce our carbon footprint by 15% in the transportation sector, by 15% by the year 2030 or 2035. But saying it is not enough. We must do it. We must then develop the measures internally that demonstrate the commitment to do it. Okay? We must, I think the plan was also to reduce the carbon footprint generated by the electrical households in the household sector by a certain percentage. We must do it. It shows responsibility and it shows your willingness to contribute to the system. And that is what gives you power. It is when you opt out as a poor country, a small country with limited resources, that undermines your credibility and your ability to speak truthfully and honestly and demand action on the part of those who have caused the problem. So it's like double speak. You're saying one thing, but you're doing the other. And it's good politics. It's politics. We live in a world of global politics. Okay? For example, look at this example. We haven't discussed this, perhaps someone might raise it. You would notice that in the situation, crisis in Gaza, there are certain countries whose policy was Israel has the right to defend itself. Full stop. Full stop. But then, some of those countries are supplying the weapons. Huh? Mm-hmm. So, in diplomacy, you have to listen to what is not said. Because that's where the real story is. It's not always what is said, it's what is left unsaid that will help you to understand what the real dynamic is. And so I think we are in a relatively strong group. No one in the UN denies that small island developing states deserve special treatment by virtue of the fact of the structural realities that attend the small island developing states. We're small, our footprint and everything is inconsequential because we're just so small, so tiny. A state like Tuvalu, 10,000 people. Montserrat now about 3,000 people are facing climate change. Where are they to get the resources to build, as Dr. Sajiwan said, to build sustainably with resilience to withstand these hurricane force winds? Where? How can they do it? Who's going to take responsibility for it? And even if they were to offer you asylum and you relocate, what does that do for your population, your national identity, your culture? These are complex issues. And that is why we have to use the time available to try to make credible progress on climate change. Can you hold your question until I've done the 6?
Okay, what the city saying then?
So that's Suriname and Guyana. The 5 have now muddled into 1. So I need to be reminded quickly.
Rachel, you asked 3 questions. One was about what happens if Trump gets elected, essentially. The next one was, sorry.
Well, I can answer that quickly, okay? Because we've had this experience before. Although there is no guarantee that the policy of the US government in a second Trump administration is likely to be precisely as it was in the first. We cannot make that assumption. That is a dangerous assumption. We must wait and see. However, we should not ignore or overlook the fact that the last time around, President Trump took the United States out of the Paris Agreement. Removed the United States altogether. It was President Biden who brought the US back to the Paris Agreement. But an interesting thing happened in the United States when President Trump took America out of the agreement. Because then individual states in the United States started to take on the obligations of the federal government and to come up with policy and action to contribute to America's ability to honor the commitment to reduce carbon. It happened in California, it happened in New York, a number of other states. Not only the states, city governments did the same thing. So there is a rising awareness. The Americans can't deny it because they're living it. All of the Bush, it's very dangerous to be a movie star living in the hills of Beverly Hills now, you know. You might come home one day and your house has been razed by fire. Americans are living it. There are rivers and lakes in the southeastern United States that have disappeared because of climate change. This is real. South Florida is at risk of sea level rise, believe it or not. Can you imagine all that expensive infrastructure on the coast, those hotels, what it will mean? So this is a really important issue. It's a global issue that demands urgent attention. And those of us who are impacted the worst, we are on the front lines of climate change in the Caribbean, in the Pacific region, in the Indian Ocean, the SIDS. Our voices need to be loud, firm, and clear. You have an obligation, and we are not allowing you to renege on it. Because after our societies are destroyed, don't believe for 1 minute that anybody in a far-flung country in Europe or the United States is going to lose sleep. They probably just regard it as collateral damage. Okay? So the obligation is ours. And that's why we must hold them to account.
Okay. Do you remember the other? You can ask one more if you can come. Please, one more, Vasha.
So, in terms of the contributions to the GCF, those nations that are not contributing, how do you get them to contribute? Is there some sort of legally binding requirements, or is it just that we sit and wait?
And that's very near to India's question about penalties.
Well, if a pledge is a pledge, and really, pledges ought to be honored. But again, a pledge is a declaration, personal or individual declaration of an intention to do something. It's not necessarily legally binding. And this is, excuse me, this is the thing with climate financing. You know, there's no sanction per se, except maybe finger pointing, name and shame. But there's no sanction for not honoring those commitments. You know, countries are just like human beings run them. You know, there are some people who, when the cameras show up, they come forward and they make the greatest statements because they want to be recorded on camera as being progressive and doing the right thing. Well, that happens in international relations. Countries come, they make commitments, they hope to implement them, and then they go away and it doesn't happen. And particularly now, in the context of aggression in Ukraine and the war in Gaza, which has caused them to focus on providing resources in both places. The question then becomes in their heads, well, where does my vital interest lie? Does my vital interest lie in protecting Europe from being overrun by the Russian Federation? There's a strongly held view that should Ukraine fall, Mr. Putin will move on next to Moldova, to Latvia, and to, I forget the third country. And there is some legitimacy to that concern. I was in Moldova, 3 weeks, maybe a month ago. There's a lot of concern there on the ground about it. Young Moldovians are leaving because there are no jobs. People are not investing because of the uncertainty. And so the countries make decisions based on their interests, their vital interests. So is it more important to help to defend Ukraine because Ukraine is helping to defend me than to pour money into climate finance to help to finance the loss and damage fund or to strengthen the adaptation fund? But the fact that these situations exist of hostility does not absolve them from the responsibility. And so someone asked about my hope for COP29, which is supposed to take place in Azerbaijan. And the Azerbaijanis have told me it will be a game-changing COP. So let's see. As it happens, look how curious this is. We had UAE, massive oil producer, massive polluter, hosting the COP. Who's next? Azerbaijan. I visited Azerbaijan officially. It's a very wealthy country. Guess why? It's an energy producing country. That's what I was saying. Double speak. Let me speak. There's no reason why the Caribbean can't host some smaller regional committee on climate change. There's none. The fact that we produce energy in this region does not disqualify us. In fact, it might be a good reason to do it. To let them come and see the effects of climate change along the coastline. The fact that during the rainy season, the food markets get very scarce because of flooding. The lack of flood insurance means farmers are out of pocket. They've invested money they can't recover because the produce can't be sold in the market. If you could find the produce, because it all has to be dumped, prices are too high, consumers are not buying. These are real effects of climate change. You know, cost of living, the cost of fruit and vegetables, that affect people's standard of living and welfare. So, where am I now? Number 4?
I think you covered most, but we have about 40 to 50 people online as well. And that's I need to keep me on time as well to let me know. Oh wow, okay. So I can't take any more questions. So let me ask the final ones, and let me give. As I said I would give people online a shot. So we have a couple of ones here. Number 1 is how do we change the culture of the world to become pro-sustainability, given like the recent example, or the ongoing example of the 2024 Paris Olympics, trying to go green and not having the full support of athletes themselves. And also, you mentioned some of the global events happening today. There are approximately around 55 active conflicts in the world today.
Yes.
Instability in different parts of the world is triggered waves of migration, lots of death. What exactly is the role of the UN in addressing the factors that force persons to migrate? And in our own hemisphere, what do you think government should be doing and non-state actors should be doing to foster the integration and full participation of particularly Haitian and Venezuelan migrants? Right? And then your final question, yes. Many students are disenchanted. In their eyes, it seems as though international legal norms are being ignored, as though might is right, and as though all people are not created equal. The same rules do not apply to everyone. Over 35,000 Palestinians are dead, and according to the UN, over 3,000 women have become widows, and over 900,000 women and girls have been displaced from their homes, and 2 mothers are killed every hour in Gaza. Is the UN making a difference? And why should students of international relations aspire to work for the UN or become diplomats?
Well, first of all, it's your choice who you aspire to work for. It's your choice. I would like to see many of you work for the UN, because I see many people who are no better qualified than you working for the UN. And if they can do it, why not you? Why not you? Taxpayers have paid to educate you. You have good degrees. Some of you might have been active in an NGO or in a community organization that has done work related to the work and activities of the UN. You have a fertile brain, you have a contribution to make. Why not work for the UN? So that's the first thing. But the choice is yours. What I would like to see is a greater number of our young people looking outwards. We tend to look inwards too much. It has to do with the fact that we are just a small island. There is a world of opportunity out there, not necessarily limited to the UN. There are all sorts of foundations doing brilliant work on women's rights, on disabilities. You name it, the work is being done. But you can find good remunerative jobs that could be fulfilling. We are living in a world where you no longer have to live where you work. Work is now footloose. You can live in Trinidad and Tobago and be working in Australia or Sweden. You're earning income from there because it's all done remotely. But you have to position yourself to do it. You have to be good. It can't be, as sometimes you hear in some places, well, that's good enough. It can't be that good enough. It has to be better than good enough. It has to be world class. But being world class is not beyond us. We've proven it so many times. We prove it in sport. We prove it in beauty competitions. We prove it in music. We prove it in literature. We prove it in academia. All the time. So why not look beyond, look outwards? There's a lot of opportunity out there. And the opportunities are basically for young people. Because everyone recognizes, including the UN, that this summit of the future business, the world that we're planning in 2030 and 2040, you are the ones who are going to have to take the decisions. You are the ones who are going to have to make informed decisions about what kind of world we should be living in. And you need to prepare to do that from now. Trinidad and Tobago has no shortage and has never had any shortage of intellect. Never. None. And so I want to encourage you young people to become involved. Go onto the UN website, check some charitable foundations, see what's going on, make a comment, get involved, write an article in the newspaper on something you care about. That's how you develop your skills. That's how you get noticed. And it will happen. Don't restrict yourself. In my career, I've had the experience of doing things, but after I had done them, I closed it, and I'm not talking about since I've been made a head of mission. I'm talking about things I've done, I've achieved as a foreign service officer. I would close my door after I do them and pinch myself because you wouldn't think normally that those things are possible. And so I learned in my professional life, the worst thing you can do is put strictures on yourself. Think everything is possible because it is. You will not know until you try. Let me give you an example. In fact, it's relevant to this time. In 1990, there was an assault on the Red House of Trinidad and Tobago. You remember that? I was posted in Canada, in Toronto. I had just arranged for the diplomatic bag to be delivered to U.W.I. and left and went home. And as I got in the house, the phone rang, I picked it up. It was a friend of mine calling me from St. Martin in a panic, saying to me, Dennis, call Trinidad, something is going on there. And before I could put down the phone, another call came in. There's a coup attempt in Trinidad. The first thing I did was call the immigration officer who was on his way to the airport to deliver the diplomatic bag, to ask him to bring the bag back. because we're not sending the bag to a government that we don't know anything about. Okay? And that, so the phone just kept ringing and ringing and ringing nonstop. Trainees from all over North America. When I couldn't take it anymore, I decided, you know what? I'm going to go outside, it was summer, and mow the lawn because the lawn was a little bit high. But in mowing the lawn, without realizing it, I accidentally cut the telephone wire. So when I go back in the house, all of a sudden the phone is quiet. Picked up the phone, no dial tone. So I got my office to call up the Bell Canada, explain to them who I was and why I needed my phone turned on right away. They did come and turn it back on. And over that weekend, that phone rang nonstop. I got no sleep. Until Sunday night, it occurred to me, Trinidadians are grieving. We have to find a way to harness this energy, to give people the sense that they are helping their country in a time of crisis. So we're going to set up an informal mechanism called the Trinidad and Tobago Emergency Relief Organization that will allow all the Trinidad and Tobago groups and organizations in Canada to send stuff, because you're getting reports. They have no gloves in the hospital. They have no cotton swabs. They have no this and they have no that. We set this up. But then a question arose. We spoke to U.W.I. They would fly everything that we collected to Trinidad free of cost. But what about those groups in Vancouver and Calgary and Nova Scotia? How are we to get those things? You can't ask people to pay. I decided I'm going to Air Canada. They fly to Trinidad and Tobago. And I got on the phone. I asked my secretary to call and say, the Deputy Consul General of Trinidad and Tobago wishes to speak urgently with the President of Air Canada. The man came on the line. I explained to him. He said to me, Mr. Francis, as much as you can bring, Air Canada will fly it to Toronto from all across Canada. So they would fly to Toronto, and we would bring it down. Can you imagine that? If I were to sit in my office and think, they would never agree. Don't put strictures on yourself. Don't limit yourself. Everything is possible if you approach it correctly and respectfully. You'll find that the world is willing to help. So, you young people, seize the moment. It's your time. It's your time. Help to shape the world and help to shape this place to be the place that it has such extraordinary potential to be. It has given us a lot. We have an obligation to give back, to help to improve people's lives, to give us longevity, to make the place safer, richer, more civil, perhaps, and to create the success that Trinidad and Tobago is capable of reaching. That's your role as the next generation. That's your task. Embrace it. Thank you.
Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking His Excellency Ambassador Dennis Francis. We have a small token of appreciation. I'm going to rise from my chair to get it. Oh, you're going to get it? Thank you so much, Darcy. This is from the Alumni Association. I think there's I think I saw Shauna here, and the current president may be here as well. If you want to come, you can come up as well, Shauna. I know that you made an attempt to see Ambassador Francis in New York. You flew up and did not, wasn't able to come up. You can bring the token. And
Well, it's one token for another because I brought you some tokens.
okay.
You know, we've been talking UN and all of that.
Okay.
I'm sure, I suspect, many of you have never really read the charter. Or, equally importantly, some might say even more important, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. These are two very important documents because these rights, these human rights that we have, no one can take them away. No one. They're God-given. And if we were to honor them, many of the problems that exist in the world would disappear. Would disappear.
What's that?
It's prejudice and hate that is driving much of what is taking place in the world. So I brought you 40 copies of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Okay, you must read it. It's written in simple language. And the drafting committee was Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of the US president. But the deputy chair of the drafting committee was an Indian diplomat, a woman. And she is the one who inserted in the document, because remember, this is being done in the 1940s. Women would not even have had the vote as yet. And she is the one who inserted in the document that everything written here is equally valid, must be equally valid for all women, everywhere. That is why the issue of gender empowerment and gender equity remains high on the agenda of the United Nations. Because we can't credibly develop this world, create sustainable societies, depend on women to raise our children and families, but then put them in the corner because they're women. They're equal partners. And they must be given, we men must respect them, assist and support them, encourage them to be their best selves and to work alongside us in taking the decisions that need to be taken for sustainable development in this country and elsewhere.
Well said. Yes, indeed.
So those of you young men who might feel that being a man means beating up on a woman and disfiguring her, which that is not acceptable. Get that out of your system. It's not right, and it will probably land you in jail. Women are human beings, no different from men. And so we must teach our sons this. We must teach our sons this. We must teach our sons the power of having a partner who is a woman and who contributes and works to build something wholesome for the family and plays an upstanding role in society. I'm a gender champion in the United Nations. I actively promote women's rights. Because there are many places in the world where women are treated as second-class citizens institutionally. You'd be surprised to know that in the most developed country in the world, women are not paid the same as men. They get 20% or 20 or 25% less pay for performing the same job as a man. Can you imagine that? So, the Universal Charter, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and the Charter of the UN. I wish I had the time to autograph them all, but take them with my appreciation for the time you spent, for the welcome and the warmth of your reception, and take them and become globalists, become global activists, make a contribution to shaping your world to make it better for all of us.
You could sign that one. And Shauna, you want to make this presentation on behalf of the Alumni Association, please.
Your Excellency, Dennis Francis, the University Alumni Association, the wider body, last year, the Institute of International Relations Alumni Association had the opportunity to nominate a distinguished alumni. And as international relations scholars and persons who look forward to charting a course that you similarly did, we thought you definitely have to be one of the persons we nominate. And we thank you so much for accepting the award. I've tried, as you said, to go to New York to say I'm delivering this award to you, but I wasn't successful, but it only meant that I got to meet you in such a better forum amongst other alumni who appreciate your hard work and all the sacrifices that you have made. Thank you so much on behalf of all the alumni and the Institute of International Relations and the wider university body. Congratulations.
I want to take a picture. Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right. So what it is left for me to do is to give the closing remarks and invite persons to meet the ambassador for the time that he has left. I know that we are short on time. So in closing, what I want to say in closing was this. All of my students that have spoken to me at length about how broken the world is and how broken the United Nations is and how much of a waste of time they think international organizations are and how the UN is a toothless tiger. I've heard many opinions on the UN, but I think the final words from Ambassador Francis ring true. When you get down to detail, when you begin to meet people face to face, you realize that change becomes possible. You realize that it is easier to steer a moving ship. If you only get started and decide that you want to be the vessel of change, you will find like-minded people who are also committed to making this planet a better place to live. And not just the planet, but your country and your community. It doesn't necessarily mean looking outward, doesn't necessarily mean that you have to get on a plane. Some of you are rooted in communities that need you. So I definitely think that today has really been inspiring. It's been insightful, and I want to thank you for being here to address us, not just in the room, but also online, because the message that we're leaving you with is there is hope. When we're able to connect, when we're able to decide that we want to make a difference, there is hope to leave this planet much better than we found it. Thank you so much for joining us. Have an amazing afternoon.